Hey everyone, it's Raz. Just wanted to give you a couple reminders about this first note session that we're doing. The idea behind these is to give you a chance to see our notes ahead of time, to get an idea of what we're going to be talking about and working with in class, and to give you time to actually write your notes down and kind of take your notes rather than taking the class time to do that. With that said, this first notes session, if you will, is actually sort of going to be three distinct things. I'm starting this kind of slow, trying to keep these bite-sized so I don't lose you. And let's see how it goes. Feel free to pause anytime you need to, write stuff down, take your time, go back if you want to. All right, here we go. So our first unit is on ecosystems. And a lot of this is going to be reviewed from bio courses, but if we're going to go ahead and talk about ecosystems, we have to talk about just kind of the vocab, the basics. So when we're looking at this, we're always going to start with an individual. Maybe trying to click, it's not going. There we go. An individual is one single organism, in this case, an elk. Population is going to be a group of that organism, so a herd of elk and how they interact. When you add up the next layer, we're looking at community. So community is going to be all of the living things in that area. So the elk, the beaver, the owl, the plant material that's there, all of those are the community. And the ecosystem, which is what we're really going to focus on in this particular part, is all of the living and the non-living things within that area. So we're taking that community and we're adding in things like air and water and soil and rocks and that sort of thing. And then we have biomes. Now we have an entire unit later on biomes, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about them here. But basically a biome just has similar climate, so similar precipitation, similar temperature, and similar plants and animals. So an example of that might be like a tropical rainforest. And then all of those biomes add up to create the biosphere, which is all of life on the planet. Now, when we start looking at ecosystems, we're going to look at how living things interact. And we use a word for a lot of these called symbiosis, which is just two species having long-term interactions within that ecosystem. And it comes from Greek, right? A lot of things Greek and Latin science related. So sym means together, bio means living. So it's literally living together, right? Now, there's lots of these. So we'll kind of take them. So I'm trying to get myself out of the way. This is not being very productive. There we go. So all of these. Competition, I'm going to talk a lot about on the next slide. So briefly mention that here, but competition is when organisms are fighting over a resource, negatively impacts both of them. So these can be interchanged with anything. So anything that's competing. Now the next type is predation. Predation, one species is helped, the other is harmed. Now in bio, you may have learned that predation is separate than parasitism. For our intents and purposes here, we just kind of lump them all together. So be aware that this is going to be anything predator-prey relationships, and this includes like herbivores, so living things that are eating their plants. It includes any kind of parasitic relationship, so fleas and ticks, that sort of thing, tapeworms, that's all predation. Mutualism is like the yay kind of symbiotic relationship where both living things are benefited. So you have two living things both having a positive takeaway from that relationship. So coral reefs are a great example of that. There's lots of them within there. One of the ones I like to use, especially this time of year, is honeybees or any kind of pollinators and the flowers they pollinate, right? The pollinator is getting the benefit of a meal of stuff it needs, and the plants are getting pollinated and they're being helped to reproduce. So they're both benefited from that. And then we have commensalism. So commensalism is sometimes tough to pick out. It's when one species is benefited, but the other is neither helped nor harmed. It's kind of neutral in the whole thing. Typically, these are when there's a really big living thing and a really small living thing, where the small living thing doesn't do enough to harm or help that big thing. So birds nesting in trees are one great example. We also think of like moss growing on a tree or barnacles growing on a whale, right? The little guy is getting some benefit, but they're not taking enough away from that larger organism to hurt them, okay? All right, so let's jump into competition a little more because this gets kind of tricky. We have two basic types of competition that you should be aware of. They're kind of obvious, just the vocab's new. So we have intraspecific competition, which is going to be competition between the same species. So you see that picture below of those wild dogs that are fighting over their kill, right? They're competing within each other. It limits population growth because, again, they're competing over resources. And a lot of times this will lead to territoriality. I feel like I pronounced that wrong, whatever. But it's going to lead to these living things kind of having their own area and not really intermingling too much. Because again, they don't really want to compete if they can help it. Then we also see interspecific competition. So that's between two different species. Now, this we see some really cool examples of, and it truly affects distribution of a whole variety of species. We actually have a principle, it's called the competitive exclusion principle. You can see kind of next to that second bullet there, which is when one species may actually exclude another from the environment. So they may actually outcompete it to a point where the other species really can't survive. We see that happen a lot with invasive species. So living things that are not normally part of that environment that end up in that environment from somewhere else, they outcompete the native species. They competitively exclude that native species. And this will lead to what we call resource partitioning. So naturally, living things want to reduce their competition, right? We kind of feel that way, I think, even as humans. We'd like to reduce the amount we're competing because it's stressful. So living things in the wild will kind of chunk their resources so that they minimize competition. So let's take a peek at what that could look like. So here's my little picture. When we have competition, we have a reduction in population size because there's fewer resources, fewer living things can survive. So if we limit that competition, the population size can actually be a little bit better off with those, and they have more things to work with. So they separate their resources or they use them in different ways in order to reduce competition. And we call that resource partitioning. And there's three major ways that living things do that. First one's called temporal partitioning. And that's the idea that they use the resource at different times. So we've got wolves and coyotes, for example, they'll hunt at different times a day. One of them will hunt at night, one of them will hunt during the day. So they're not actually directly competing with each other. The next one is called spatial partitioning, and this one gets a little bit tricky, but the general idea is that they're using different areas of their habitat. So this first picture I have over here for you are two different plants, and you can see that tar bush has those really long roots, right? It can grow those super long roots, and it's going to pull nutrients from way down deeper in that soil. So water, nutrients, it's pulling from down there, whereas the black grama grass is kind of on the surface. So it's going to pull resources from shallower. They're not competing because they're using separate areas. There's actually a really famous example of this with the warbler. So these are 5 different species of warbler. They all live in the same tree, but they use different sections of it. And you can see that kind of distinguished in that image by the lighter yellow. So just again, they're using different areas of the tree, so they're not competing. Okay, and then the last type is what we call morphological partitioning. So this is the idea that living things will evolve adaptations to use resources, specifically for them. So for example, the ferret and the ermine that are here, the ferret's got much bigger teeth, right? The ermine doesn't. The ferret's probably going to eat food sources that allow it to use those teeth. The ermine's going to use ones that don't need those teeth. So those evolutionary adaptations have led to them using resources different. That's obviously a much slower process. All right. So at this point, you've got a pretty good idea of a whole bunch of stuff on ecosystems. Your job now is to navigate back to Canvas, open up your FRQ document. Remember, this is a document that we're going to be working on little chunks. We'll be going over the FRQs on the days they're due in class, and we'll be turning them in as one big kind of collective at the end of this unit. So your first one is FRQ 1.1. And I would like for you to look at the food web that's here. And again, I know we haven't really done a ton of food webs, but this should be a review from bio. Identify 2 organisms that compete for a food source and describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the 2 organisms you identified. If you need to, go back and look at your FRQ Power Words PDF that's also on Canvas. Look up, identify, and describe and figure out what exactly you need to do to answer those questions correctly and give it a shot. We'll talk about it in class when it's due. Thanks for hanging with me and happy note taking.